Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Rarely do we get an opportunity to sit down with a serving law enforcement officer on this podcast. But today, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're talking to none other than the Commissioner of Australian Border Force. Australian Border Force is a federal law enforcement agency responsible for offshore and onshore border enforcement, investigations, compliance, detention operations, and the Customs Service. Today's guest, Commissioner Michael Outram, has an extensive law enforcement career spanning over 40 years, including working in the London Met as a detective, then transferring to New South Wales Police. He then went across to the Australian Federal Police, and that put him on track to be heading up the Australian Border Force. He has a fascinating and diverse career, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat today, so let's get started. Michael Outram, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Great to be here, Gary. Thank you.
Well, I know how busy you are, and this is about the third or fourth attempt that we've had to get you on.
It is, and today the gods nearly conspired against us again in terms of travel getting from here to Canberra, but it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for making the time. I've got to say, and first of all, as with the introduction, the Commissioner of Australian Border Force, I've been a police officer for a long time, or I had been a police officer for a long time. I think you've got 40 years in law enforcement?
Yeah, I walked into the gates at the Hendon Police College in London in September 1980.
Okay. You've seen and done a bit, and I'm sure you would have seen some changes. We might touch on that. Speaking to a commissioner, I'm always inclined to call you, and I think this is the police inbred in me, commissioner or sir, boss type of thing, because we're very structured in law enforcement. So is it all right if I call you Michael for the podcast?
It's perfectly fine that you call me Michael, Gary.
Yeah. You've worked in a couple of different law enforcement, London Metropolitan Police. I think you're there for 20 years working as a detective. You did a stint in New South Wales Police, the Australian Federal Police, and now you're head of the Australian Border Force. How did you find going through the different areas of law enforcement? Was it a change, or did it feel like a natural evolution?
Yeah, it's a bit like sliding doors moments, isn't it? So moving from the Metropolitan Police into New South Wales, ready to secondment with New South Wales Police for 6 months was great. I worked with the New South Wales Crime Commission, very much at the pointy end of investigating organised crime. And so whilst the methodologies differed, coercive powers in particular, and that's what we're interested in having a look at, the culture and the attitude of the detectives to getting the briefs of evidence was pretty much the same. When I then moved to Australia, working with the ICAC, wow, straight into the sort of heart of government, if you like, public service, corruption and all of that, and looking at not just the investigation side, but the intelligence and the prevention and education and research. That was on my journey that I learnt a lot from that. About the importance of not just getting the heads on the spikes, if you like, but also understanding what is it about organisations that actually can make them more susceptible to misconduct. And then from there I went to the Australian Crime Commission, as it was then, now the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, and that was really, well, whilst I was initially running the operations and joint task forces, which was great because I got to know all the AC's crime around the country and all of that, that was really where you start to see the strategic intelligence and the sort of the high-level organised crime intelligence, the operations coming together, again with the use of coercive power. So that was another step on the journey about better understanding the system that we operate in.
Okay.
If you can call it that.
Just to clarify coercive powers for people, I think people would have heard this on the podcast discussing coercive powers, but with the New South Wales Crime Commission, the Australian Crime Commission, coercive powers usurp that right to silence, and it's a very powerful investigative tool that if you get put before a commission with those coercive powers, you're basically obliged to answer questions.
Yeah, the powers are all commission.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of, rightly so, legislative rules around the use of those powers, but ultimately they're about a search for the truth. But of course what you can't do then is use those powers for criminal or civil impositions of penalties against people who provide information, because as you rightly say, they're coerced, they're compelled legally to give information. So they're a very powerful legislative tool for law enforcement to use, but they've got to be used very judiciously.
Yeah, most definitely. You need those checks and balances. But as you said, it's a search for the truth. I always had difficulty explaining to people when I was using the powers, those coercive powers of crime commissions or Royal Commission, that you can't use that in a criminal proceeding or a civil matter, and people just didn't understand it. But the cornerstone of our justice system over here, and I also know in the UK, is that right to silence. Yeah, it's up to the prosecutors, the investigating people, to prove the case rather than you.
Exactly right.
Disprove it. But we're going to talk about Australian Border Force, because in the pre-briefing before the sit-down here, you made a point that you don't want to spend 2 hours, which I would quite happily do, sitting here talking about your career, that we want to focus on Australian Border Force. A lot of people don't know what the role of Australian Border Force is. I think people see law enforcement, it's just a police officer. They don't distinguish between it. Australian Border Force, as I understand, was formed in 2015.
That's correct, yep.
What was the genesis of why it was formed?
So we had a customs service, and you'd be familiar, former police officer, we did a lot of work with the customs service. And in 2015, the government at that time decided to create an integrated border agency. So they brought the customs service in, elements of immigration enforcement and compliance, so detention, removals, field operations, the functions at the airports and seaports around immigration, and also what we call Maritime Border Command, which is like our Coast Guard function. So you've got an integrated border agency, and the way I best describe it is it's quite unique for Australia. I think there's a lot of advantages to that integration around understanding the risks at the border and having an agile workforce that can manage those risks. But when I go and interact with my counterparts internationally, in some countries I have to interact with 5 different organisations who do the one thing that we do. So it
does make a lot of sense to have it under one umbrella, doesn't it?
It does for Australia. I think it's for every country. I mean, in the United States, Customs and Border Protection is 60,000 people. Yeah. So you add more on top of that, it just gets too big and unwieldy. But for Australia, we're about 5,500 people in the Australian Border Force. And so if you think about the customs service that we provide, we collect about 20 billion a year in revenue for the government. So, we're the second biggest collector of duty after the tax office. We have to regulate trade and travel, not stop it. Yep. So, but we also have to stop prohibited imports coming in, so narcotics and firearms and other abhorrent things that come across the border. And we work very closely with, of course, state and territory police and federal police and international counterparts in relation to the management of border. And the difference between the border and the police is, and let me say, when I first went to what was then the Customs Service, I thought I knew everything about customs and the borders. And I realise now that I actually knew almost nothing.
Nothing like a little bit of overinflated confidence to get you through it.
And I'm still learning. It's the borders are a really complicated system. But the best way I would describe the border to people, you think about $1 trillion in two-way trade goes across our border. Our economic security and prosperity relies on that border being effective. So we've got to regulate and enforce laws in that space without grinding it to a halt. So our relationships with travellers, with industry, across government, with Department of Agriculture, internationally, is vital to enable that movement of money, goods, people, to help us to continue with our way of life, but to make sure that, and crooks, you get this, crooks though know how to penetrate that system and to use
exploit it.
Yeah.
There's a real economic component to it then that I think people don't probably appreciate. But you can't have the borders open and anything can be imported, and without proper tax, the economy would fall apart.
It would, and moreover, you've got supply chain issues where people need goods. Our manufacturing industry need the goods they want to import. Our agricultural industry needs the goods they need to import to generate and produce well for our country. So if we slow down containers, if we slow down international air cargo and things like that unnecessarily, we hear pretty quickly from industry.
When's my new car arriving?
You've got it.
And building material and electronic components, that new TV. Yeah,
you've got it. And so we've got to balance, if you like, the economic needs, and that's what the border is primarily there to do, is to actually enable our country to remain prosperous and economically secure, but to make sure our community is protected. And that's a real balancing act every day. To make sure we get that balance right.
And I would imagine a country like a continent the size of Australia, that's not necessarily an easy job.
Pretty difficult. We've got nearly 30,000 kilometres of coastline, 60 international seaports, 8 international airports. Our exclusive economic zone, which is the seas that surround Australia, where we call it our exclusive economic zone, is one of the biggest in the world at 8.2 million square kilometres. So if you think about the size of the Australian border, geographically, it's huge. and let alone then the amount of containers, 3-4 million containers a year coming in, those sorts of things, and to regulate and have line of sight on the risk and the threat that all presents as well as the opportunity is a real challenge.
So with, and I think people understand international ports like the ships coming in, the container ships and the airports and the type of things, but with Australia, you've also got all this coastline. That's
lots of coastline. So you think about, the regulated ports, think about the Pilbara. We've got thousands of bulk carriers, as we call them, coming in to and from Australia carrying iron ore or salt or whatever it is we export. So there's obviously container ships coming into the main ports, and a lot of these ships bounce around our coastline from port to port to port. Then we've got leisure craft that come and go, yachts and super yachts and all those sorts of things, fishing industry, boats coming in and going. So if you think about all the small ports and then the coastline, organised crime has a lot of opportunities to import things into Australia that they would rather we didn't know about.
Well, we often see, and I'm talking from a local policing perspective, you see the results of drugs on the street, and we'll talk about some of the cases that the Australian Border Force have been involved in. But drugs, guns, that type of stuff. So forgetting the economic side of things, for which is vitally important to all of us, but you've also got that criminal aspect, isn't it?
It's significant. So let's take the last year. The number of detections of cocaine for the Australian Border Force, we've doubled.
Right.
And traditionally, we get about 2 tonnes a year. The last 12 months, we've jumped to 4 tonnes with some huge seizure of cocaine. We still consume, we know this through the ACIC's wastewater analysis, far more methamphetamine, though, than we do cocaine. That allows us to have a look at, by tonne, what narcotics are getting across our borders. Some of it's produced in Australia, but a lot of it's coming as finished product. And so what I can say is that we know that we probably detect about 25% on a good day.
Okay.
And that's notwithstanding that we've doubled our strike rate in the last 10 years. So there's still more that we have to do to keep up with and to try and interact against organised crime.
Well, I've heard crooks, no names, no pack drills, but talk about the importation of drugs and saying, well, if we lose one container, we've got 3 others coming through, so we can offset. We factor that loss in there. Is that the type of scale we're talking about? That what you're seizing, there's probably working on the basis that there's a large percentage that's getting through?
Yeah, we reckon 75% getting through.
Okay.
And that's just narcotics. So if you think about tobacco, then, the profit margins in tobacco are significant too, illicit tobacco. And then there are other illegal goods as well being brought into our country. But containers is probably by volume, the biggest problem we have, but not the only one.
Yeah.
We've seen importations from ships dropping drugs into the sea around our coastline, being picked up by smaller ships.
There was one up at Newcastle not that long ago, wasn't there? Or I'm not sure. It was a small vessel into the Newcastle harbour, or had some drugs attached to the hull of a ship.
Yeah, the hull of a ship. So there's a couple of different things that happen. Sometimes they come on a ship and they'll be dropped into the ocean to be picked up by a smaller ship, mother-daughter ship. Sometimes they'll be concealed underneath a ship in sea chests or on some sort of attachment or around the rudder. And you need divers to get down and retrieve that, and that's what happened in Newcastle.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and we had one recently in Western Australia, it was concealed within the ballast tanks within a cargo ship. So there's no end of ways, and that was 850 kilos of cocaine.
And they are inventive, and we're not giving any credit to them, but they are inventive in their methods on the way of getting past security, aren't they?
Very inventive, and they're the big importations, but then, of course, we have lots of parcels and packets coming into our country.
Yeah,
that are containing smaller amounts of narcotics through air cargo, things like FedEx, DHL, Australia Post, and so we have to be alert to all that as well. And there's a lot of sort of small importations that add up to a lot.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. A lot of people, their impression of Australian Border Force would be what happens at the airports, customs, going through customs, that type of thing. What's your role? Could you describe the role of Australian Border Force around airports when we're going on our holiday?
Certainly. So when somebody's departing Australia, of course, we have to first of all check, are there any sort of alerts in relation to those people? We work very closely with the police and other agencies. So when people are checking in outbound, as we say, we'll know pretty much straight away whether there are any passengers who pose a problem who shouldn't be leaving our country.
Yeah.
We'll obviously then intervene in some way. From a customs service point of view, the biggest challenge is people coming back to the country, either Australians or non-Australians. And first of all, we have to make sure that they're eligible to come to Australia. So we get advanced information from other airports, so we know that either you've got an Aussie passport or you've got a visa. We have airline liaison officers stationed in some ports in other countries, and they offload about 300 passengers a year don't get onto the aeroplane because our Border Force officers find there's a problem with either their travel documentation or there's some problem. And we reckon that each one of those offloads saves our country about $70,000 because of the cost then of trying to remove somebody from the country when they get here. Then when you arrive, we have to clear you from an immigration point of view. So you go through the smart gates.
Yep.
Or you
Love the smart gates.
I do too. Or you'll see a Border Force officer.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got to go and get your bag.
Yep.
And then we get interested from a customs point of view as what's inside that bag or what's inside your mobile device. Because unfortunately, I've got to say, over recent times, we've seen a huge uptick in the amount of people bringing child abuse material and other sensitive on their phones and mobile devices, and they're goods. What's in mobile devices are goods. So we search about 1% of travellers' phones, only about in fact, far less than 1%, and 1 in 3 times we find material that they shouldn't be bringing to our country, and that's led to some amazing outcomes.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. In one case, 16 children in another country were actually found and taken from harm's way.
So talk us through that, because this is something that I don't think people fully appreciate, but just uncovering something like that, how it led to recovery of 16 children.
Yeah, so in that case, of course, my officers down in Adelaide made that discovery in somebody's mobile phone, and every time we find that, we refer it to Australian Federal Police, who have the Australian Centre for Countering Child Exploitation, of course, and they work very closely with other countries. So that information, that intelligence went into the ACE. And then from there, another country were engaged by the AFP. They ended up doing warrants in another country and 16 children being found and removed from harm's way.
Wow. Okay. That's the importance of that puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely right.
The day-to-day policing, you've got the Australian Federal Police there for the airports. And so the Australian Border Force, what we're looking at, they're the people, as you said, that you're going through when you're going through what we'd call customs. Yeah.
And so we're keeping an eye on baggage handlers.
Yep.
Companies that work airside, because we've got to be careful as well that those organisations and employees are not importing drugs through the supply chain. So we've got a role there. We have to make sure that the movement of passengers is maintained. Otherwise, the airports ring us pretty quick if we start to get queues, if we slow things down. So we've got that balance to maintain.
No one's happy if you delay the holiday.
And we do. We've got detector dogs and those things around the carousel. We work very closely with the Department of Agriculture. The other thing I would say to your listeners, bear in mind that travelling to Australia, our agricultural industry is pretty precious for our economy, and they're on the lookout for people bringing things to our country that could, wreck our
timber, vegetable matter with bugs in it.
Things with bugs in and that sort of stuff. So we work side by side with Department of Agriculture at airports.
Okay, that's one of the roles. Also, you have some. I suppose it factors in with what you're talking about from other countries, people coming in to Australia trying to get in. That counter-terrorism. You'd have alerts, like notices from Interpol or wherever.
So we work very closely with the AFP. So obviously the AFP and ASIO are two of our Commonwealth partners, and we work very closely with them. We have electronic systems, and so if they need us to take action against a passenger, we'll know electronically to do that.
Yeah.
And of course the AFP are on the site, so if there's any need for anybody to be arrested or if the AFP need to use their powers, then we just work with them on site. They're there 24/7, 365 like we are.
You do need that some tight security around airports, don't you, for obvious reasons?
Obviously. And this is where I think, if you think about the risks of people smuggling narcotics through an aviation sector. So if you think about people using an aeroplane or aviation crew to bring narcotics into our country, well, they could carry other things too.
Yeah.
So the risks converge. And it's really important, therefore, that that the airport precinct is well managed, that only people with the appropriate passes get into secure areas, that they're all vetted, we know who they are and those sorts of things. So it's actually a really well regulated environment. We work very closely not just with the AFP but with the airport operators as well. Each airport operate, we've got a close relationship with.
Well, you mentioned the baggage handlers, and that was certainly something that came to the fore. It might have been for your time when there was a lot of criticism about what was going on, or people involved in allowing things to get in that perhaps shouldn't.
Yeah, we've more recently, I don't know if you remember, Gary, the AFP did an operation called Operation Ironside.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, a lot of people heard
Just
about it.
Explain it, because I think it's one of the great operations of law enforcement.
That's
Loved
brilliant.
it.
Yeah, so the AFP worked with FBI and others internationally, and they used an encrypted communications platform called Anon. And the crooks who were using it thought that they were secure on it, but in fact they were actually, being listened to, intercepted by law enforcement. So we got a really unique insight into organised crime in Australia and internationally. And what, for me, as the Commissioner of the Border Force, what that confirmed, we already suspected, was that the Australian border has been infiltrated by serious organised crime. And so we stood up an operation called Jardina in the back end of 2020. And we've been doing it ever since. And we've identified probably about 1,000 people who work at our borders, some in airports, some in seaports, some in freight forwarding businesses, some in licensed brokerages, customs brokerages, or warehouse or depot operators. About 1,000 people at our border that we think have got connections to serious and organised crime.
Okay. And these are the people that are involved in that chain, the chain of bringing material in, and that's what was uncovered.
Yeah, and we call them trusted insiders or doors. And what happens here is, of course, you can conceal things in a container that, where it's goods are what we call ripped on in another port after it's been sealed on a port side.
Yeah.
And then when it gets to Australia, they're ripped off. And the rip-on, rip-off methodology, we call it. And it's used a lot by organised crime. And you need people in the supply chain to do that.
Right.
Both ends.
And have you had success with Operation Jardine?
We've had some huge successes, and in fact, what we worked out pretty quickly was that what's getting ripped off in Australia is getting ripped on somewhere else. So we need to work internationally. I had a phone call with the Deputy Secretary General of the World Customs Organisation sometime during the pandemic, and he sent me his draft strategic plan for feedback. And I spoke to him and I said, so, Ricardo, I think it's a wonderful plan, but the one thing that's keeping me awake at night isn't a priority in your plan. And he said, what's that? I said, the infiltration of the international supply chain by transnational serious organised crime. It's a massive problem, Ricardo. So he agreed, and it now is a priority for the WCO. But since then, we led, the Australian Border Force went up to Brussels. We pulled in a number of the shipping lines like Maersk and MSC and others. And we ran a joint operation with 58 other customs administrations for 6 weeks and the shipping lines. And we seized nearly 100 tonnes of cocaine in that 6 weeks.
Right. That's a lot of cocaine.
And 70% of that, roughly, was using that RIP methodology I just talked about.
Okay.
So yes, we have absolutely had huge successes.
So for that RIP methodology, you need someone on the inside for that to work.
The best way I can describe it to you is, imagine you and I, we've done business for a long time. You're exporting furniture to me.
Yep.
You pack up your container, it gets sealed.
Yep.
Then somebody opens your container and they conceal drugs in it without your knowledge. And of course, that container's low risk because we've done a lot of business together.
And you'd look at the history of it. They've been importing that furniture for the last 20 years.
Exactly right. And when it arrives in Australia somewhere from the wharf to somewhere else in a warehouse, whilst it's under so-called customs control, that gear will be ripped out of that container without anyone seeing it. So to achieve that, you need trusted insiders both in the origin port and in the Australian port.
Okay. So it is organised crime operating.
It's very organised.
And the rewards for that type of thing, if you're putting drugs into a container, you can fit a substantial amount. It's not an individual mule carrying whatever they got in their luggage.
You think about cocaine, roughly on average $200,000 a kilo, $200,000 that is Australian a kilo.
Yeah.
And in a fairly big bag, you get a few kilos.
Do you come across people that are still doing the individual drug runs? That's still very much part of it?
We do. And so our officers at the airports, and obviously, we've got cruise ships coming to Australia and those sorts of things. That's what they're on the lookout for. People's, luggage, airline crew as well. We've had airline crew, bringing drugs into our country. So we've got to be constantly on the lookout. And whether it's drugs, whether it's tobacco, it's a constant challenge for us, and biosecurity as well.
Airports are notorious for strange things happening and funny things happening? Have you had things happen, or someone trying to bring something into the country you just think, what's going on here? Like the 10 live chickens in the suitcase, or
Yeah, well, obviously we have the Border Security Show, which we, our officers and those from our colleagues at Agriculture feature on a lot.
You've got a lot of fans on that.
And it's one of the. It's amazing when I go overseas. So many people say to me, that show's great, and it gets watched all over the world. So people like that. But yeah, obviously food. Food's a big challenge. People bringing in food that's potentially harmful, as I said, to our agriculture industry. But, the consumption of narcotics, tobacco, we get a lot of people trying to bring, you think about how much it is for a packet of cigarettes these days because the profits available in tobacco. So the entire suitcase can be just full of, cigarettes. They'll give it a run.
Yeah.
And sometimes people, try and take out of the country a lot of cash, expensive items of jewellery or whatever. We worry a little bit about trade-based money laundering, which is where we're talking about money laundering by either exporting cash or buying high-value goods to sell in another country. So we've got to be alert to what people are bringing and taking through our airports.
Okay. Covering off on airports, what about detention areas?
Gosh, yeah. So detention,
because that's another thing that comes under your control.
it is a completely different part of the business, but equally.
I raise that, and we'll sort of tie it all in later. But the diversity of the type of work that Australian Border Force is involved in.
So our officers do a brilliant job. So we've got officers working all around the coastline with 15 other countries around the world, because as I say, our borders are connected to everybody else's borders. It's a really interesting job. People working in the Pilbara, people working in the Torres Strait, people working in Sydney, including in detention centres. And so that's a really quite challenging but rewarding part of our work. And we have a number of detention centres where we have service providers like Serco and International Health and Medical Services who provide services inside. But what's happened over the last 7 or 8 years is that the profile of detainees has completely changed, like 180 degrees.
Talk us through that.
So in about, I think it's 2013 or 14, the government introduced changes to the Migration Act in terms of Section 501, which is where if somebody's convicted to a 12 months or more in jail, or the minister decides that there are reasons to cancel their visa on character grounds, maybe organised criminality, then they're mandatorily cancelled their visas and therefore they have to be detained and removed.
Yep.
And so what we have today is that we've got about 11 or 1,200 detainees in Australia in our detention centres. Of those, about 90% have been involved in the justice system. And of those, about 70 to 80% are regarded as high to extreme risk in terms of where we place them. And we see standover tactics. We see, unfortunately, people smuggling narcotics into our detention centres, organised crime from our detention centres, because people are allowed to have phones and internet and those sorts of things, because it's a detention under the Migration Act. It's not punitive.
Yep.
So we're really challenged to keep our staff, contractors and detainees safe at the moment. We don't have the kinds of powers that corrections services would have in prisons, but the population very much resembles that of a prison.
I've been into, I think it was Villawood. There was a suspicious death there, and in as a homicide investigator looking around. The way you described it is how I saw it too. There was a lot of freedoms that you wouldn't get in even a minimum security prison, but they were afforded to the detainees for the reasons you've just outlined. But there was still a sense of menace around there.
Very much so.
I could imagine working in that environment and being responsible for that. It would be a difficult environment to work in.
It's a challenging environment, and so our people do an amazing job, because you can imagine it's also a very politicised environment. Anything to do with detention and removal of people's sort of rights in that regard. So the margins for error for our officers operationally are not great.
Yeah.
And so we have to operate with great precision. So it's an area, in fact, that a lot of our officers want to go and work, because they want to learn the tradecraft, if you like, of operational excellence and planning and execution. But it is challenging because they get called all sorts of names. It's a political, and they also learn, therefore, and you've got this being a former police officer, sometimes you've got to let stuff wash over you.
Don't take it personally.
Because you know that what you're doing for the good of the country
Yeah.
is what really matters, and there are always going to be some people who don't like what you do.
Well, the offshore detention centres is a point of contention that have been simmering for years in this country. So do you have people in ABF, do they transition between the different areas?
Very much so. So we have a mobility policy like the police would have.
Yep.
So we encourage our officers to move from, say, airports to cargo inspection operations to compliance operations. We have investigators, of course,
Yeah.
and, of course, detention and removal operations. There's so many different areas. We have mariners. We have about 600 officers who work on ships at sea. They go to sea for 4 weeks at a time, undertake operations to do with Operation Sovereign Borders or illegal fishing and protection of our reefs and resources.
And on those vessels, you've got the ABF, or they're ABF vessels?
Yeah, ABF vessels and ABF officers. We have a number of Cape-class vessels and large vessels at the ABF, and we also, obviously, Defence, we work very closely with Defence, so we have a number of naval patrol boats that work in support of us as well. We have a fleet of about 10-8s.
Dash 8s?
Airplanes
Oh,
that,
right.
that surveil our
Okay.
oceans, and we obviously work with Defence in that regard too. So Maritime Border Command, which sits within the Australian Border Force, is a joint agency task force with Defence and ourselves and fisheries and those sorts of agencies, AFP. And we try and surveil our 8.2 million square kilometres of ocean for badness. We have a lot of. We have satellites. We have a lot of data coming in about the thousands of vessels that are around our coastline at any point in time. And we go and obviously surveil the oceans in order that we can queue on the boats on the water to take action where we need to.
I'm getting the sense why you passed up about 3 invitations here at short notice. You've got a lot of responsibility.
There's a lot on in the Border Force, and that's what makes it a great job. But it's a very challenging at times job, and one that I love. I mean, the importance of what we do for our country is the thing that strikes me the most about our workforce. It's not lost on them.
They get it.
They get it.
Okay. With the detention centres, I remember, and this is going back a long time ago, so probably 20 years ago, but I used to do a lot of situations where people were being deported and they needed an escort. I used to do that quite often on commercial flights, and led to some interesting times.
Yeah, we now use Serco, our contractor, to do those escorts.
Yeah.
But we also sometimes put on our own charters.
Yeah.
Because there are times where we have a lot of detainees we want to remove to a particular part of the world, maybe Africa or maybe the Middle East. So we tend to try and, remove a whole lot at once, because sometimes it's difficult on commercial airlines to get the compliance, and get the detainees to agree to go on a commercial airline.
I've had one, and then we all got kicked off the airplane when he decided that he didn't want to travel after all.
Indeed, and the pilots can't take people that are non-compliant like that. Obviously, commercial pilots, and indeed, even on our charters, we have to be conscious of the fact that they have to be fit to fly, and pilots have a responsibility to keep the airplane safe. So obviously, we try and make sure that our detainees are ready, psychologically ready to undertake that step. I laugh at it, but it wasn't lost on me, the humanity of it. Like, some people were going back to places they didn't want to go back. Some people were going back to places where they had genuine concern for their safety, and Yeah, generally speaking, if there's a concern about safety, there are obviously laws and international agreements that Australia's a signatory to make sure that we don't send people into harm's way, and people have the right to claim protection while they're in Australia if they are in those circumstances. And we do have a lot of and quite a generous, humanitarian program in Australia. So we just want to clarify: we don't send people to countries where there'd be a legal problem in doing so from a safety point of view. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. But it is a contentious issue, and it is hard to manage, because the counter arguments, you can't just have open borders, you can't let anyone come, and then the argument, well, what about the humanity and that? So I can imagine you guys being caught up in the middle of it, and you're actually just enforcing the laws of the country.
You're right, and so borders are, if you think about what they define, it's not just a line on a map.
No.
They define our sovereign legal jurisdiction, the area in which our laws apply to everyone in that area, and the rights of countries to determine who should come and not come to their country, and who should be resident in their country, and those sorts of things. So the borders are quite a, I suppose, recent phenomenon. If you look at how long humanity's been around, but they're important economically, they're important from a security point of view. They define our sovereignty and those things. And so our job as the Australian Border Force is to make sure that our laws, Australian laws, are upheld, whether it's on our high seas, whether it's around our, tens of thousands of kilometres of coastline or wherever. But politically, it's contentious. I would agree
Yeah.
with you, and that means that our officers have to be even more on their game operationally.
Most definitely. If someone makes a mistake, it's not going to be not going to reflect well.
Exactly right.
Do you, and I don't reveal methodology here, but do you think it's more difficult to travel internationally and cross borders these days? Like, I know the thought was for old crooks, you could always get a false passport and skip the country. I would imagine with technology and that's becoming harder and harder. Would that be fair to say?
It's becoming harder. I think the more we bring sort of biometrics into the equation, the harder it will become. And of course, this is where we again have to navigate the balance between privacy and biometric and data matching. If you want a really secure border that can transact, travel and trade at lightning speed, it has to be digital in the future. We're predicting a 70% growth in cargo in the next 10 years.
Yep.
If we want to facilitate that amount of cargo without slowing it down, we can't be relying on manual processes. Same with travellers, with passengers. If we have to be checking passports manually and those sorts of things, we'll slow it down. So we've got to, I think, grapple with what does a digital border in the future look like? Because without it, we won't be able to manage crisis. We won't be able to manage the growth in trade and travel. We won't be able to manage speed that industry and the economy needs.
Okay, so when you're describing the digital border, you're not just go through the fast tracking at the airport with the looking into the camera. You're talking about the container ships, what's coming over in planes, everything being digitally examined.
Everything. So in an ideal world, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In an ideal world, you could fly to Australia from anywhere and you could come off the aeroplane and go straight onto a domestic flight, and the first time you'll see your suitcase will be when you get off the aeroplane, say in Tamworth.
Yeah.
What happens today is that you'll come into Australia, your immigration status will be checked at the Smart Gate or the ABF primary line. You'll go to a baggage carousel, you'll wait. You will then go to the back of the hall where you'll be checked from a customs and a biosecurity point of view, red lane, green lane, and then you'll drag your bag, recheck it, and go through it all again, and then get your domestic flight. That's unnecessary in a digital world, where we will know your identity from the point where you board, and we'll know you're either an Australian passport holder or you've got a visa. We'll get the image of your scanned bags images from where you embark, so we'll know there's no drugs and explosives and those sorts of things in the bag. And you can imagine how seamless that would be.
You got my vote.
It
definitely got my vote.
So that's the vision. Yeah. The question is, how do we get there? And we're working with industry, on some trials and pilots, and the government. We've got some a microeconomic reform agenda called the Simplified Trade System, where we're doing work, cargo intervention models and those sorts of things to build towards that future. I'd love to be able to screen every container coming into Australia in real time as it comes off the ship.
And one would think with technology and the advancements that it's not that far away.
It's not that far away. In fact, I hosted only 2 or 3 weeks ago the head of Dutch Customs.
Yep.
Now, Dutch Customs, small jurisdiction, about the same size as the Australian Border Force, though, but in the port of Rotterdam, they've only got one port, basically.
Yeah.
They have 4 times more containers coming through that port in a year than the whole of Australia.
Right.
And they've got massive, issues about, they're one of the main ports for the whole of Europe. They have to get stuff through, and they have a lot of drugs coming through that port.
Yeah.
So they are very much one of the leading customs administrations in terms of technology that they're putting in place at that port. And so we're learning from those sorts of jurisdictions to think about what's the blueprint for Australia in the future.
Okay, so there's a lot that goes into it. I know I said I'm not going to talk about your career. Just before the break, I just want to. This is career question number 1, so I'm just going to slip them in. We'll keep a tally on them. So, your time in the London Metro Police, then you came to New South Wales. What was your experience in the London Metro Police?
So the first question I had when I joined as a cadet,
September
1980, was, have I done the right thing? Is this for me?
Yeah.
16-year-old, didn't know whether I'd done the right thing. And you get this. I was doing shopping in Oxford Street in central London, and I saw a guy rip a bag off a lady, push it to the ground and take off. Without thinking, I took after him. Chased him a long way.
You were born
he
to
was
be a
he was
policeman.
fit, and I chased him all the way down Oxford Street through Christmas shopping, rugby tackled him, big dust up, and that's the point at which I thought, I'm
born for this.
I'm born for this. And other moments, I remember when I was in the anti-terrorist branch, back in those days, the IRA were launching a lot of attacks in
Yeah.
London, and we got a coded message at SO13, as it was called, and we actually got in a van, stupidly, to
Yeah.
go to where they'd said that a bomb would go off. And what we didn't know was it was going to be one of the biggest bombs the City of London had ever seen. And on the way there, we heard it go, and it was the bomb that blew up in St Mary Axe. It destroyed the Baltic Exchange.
Right.
It wrecked numerous buildings. It was massive. The crater was like 12 metres deep in the road. And I was, one of the first three on scene.
Wow.
And I've never seen devastation and carnage like that in the middle of a big city like London. And again, that's one of those moments in time where you think, yeah, I was called to this vocation. I investigated homicides. I was sent, to India and places investigating homicides.
Yep.
You get that former homicide detective.
Yeah.
It's a great.
It's you're getting paid to catch killers. It's, yeah.
And somebody taught me to take in promotion at one point.
Yep.
If they hadn't have done, I was a detective sergeant for 7 years. I was really happy. Maybe the happiest I've ever been.
Look, and we talk law enforcement. I think I was at my happiest as a detective sergeant.
There you go.
You're at the right level. You've got the influence to steer a case the way you want. You don't have to answer above. Let the inspector sort that one out, and you got your team. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So pivotal moments and then, the chance to come to Australia was one of those sliding doors moments as well. My attitude has always been, when you get opportunity, take it. I'm a bit of a risk taker in that regard. I sort of back myself and say, okay, I fancy that adventure, let's go and have a crack at that.
Well, it keeps you fresh, and I think policing in that time period that you were in London, it would have been intense. That London is that international city.
Yeah.
And there was a lot going on. So
very intense, and and things like, I'll never forget, the impact that there's a death of a young black lad called Stephen Lawrence in London that had on the organisation.
Yep.
Reading every night about your organisation being systemically racist and those sorts of things, and there were some hard times.
Yeah.
Whereas an organisation, you'd say to yourself, but I'm not, and I don't. Those people around me are not racist, but you had to accept that the perception of the Met wasn't always great, and not every case was handled the way it could have been and should have been, and so it wasn't a walk in the park by any means. I mean, the Met was even then in the late 90s, operating in a very political space.
Yeah. And I think, and you touched on it very early when we first started speaking, that, if people are, abusing you, for want of a better word, but not, it's not you personally, it's what you represent. And
Exactly.
I think, we went through New South Wales. We had the Police Royal Commission. I was a major crime detective, and there was a lot of shame that was brought on, and it reflects badly on you. And we've had incidents in the past where racism's come into play, and you'd like to think that we learn by those mistakes. And I think policing does evolve. People learn, but there's always, you've got that power, and power can corrupt, can't it?
It can, and I think that's. When people ask me now about the ABF, so I've been, sort of talking about industry and the infiltration by organised crime. Whenever I talk about these things, I talk about my own organisation, and I would say, I'm so proud of my officers and the work they do, but I'd never claim to be, corruption-proof in that regard, because these people have got deep, deep pockets, and you just don't know if one of your officers, wrong time in their life, they're in debt, gambling problems, addiction problems, somebody gets them in their pocket, It's an area that we've always got to be vigilant around. And you're right. So with a lot of autonomy in policing, powers, those sorts of things, and it's a difficult culture to nurture. And you look at the challenges, whether it's to do with racism or corruption or sexism, misogyny. Yeah. The challenges that policing have faced over the last decade alone. It's not for the faint-hearted. Trying to take on those leadership issues. And in the ABF, I've signed up to a partnership, for example, with the Human Rights Commission, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, for 5 years to come in and look under the bonnet.
I think that's a good system. If it's people can see into what's going on, and I think it makes a hell of a difference with the way that an organisation is run. Because when it's shut doors, and I think that was the problem with policing to a degree, in it was very closed. Don't worry
Yep.
about this, ma'am. Inquiries are continuing, and early arrest is expected. We just close doors. You're smiling because you know
Yeah.
when you're a young cop, that was the type of narrative. Don't worry about what the public think. We're the cops.
Yeah, we know best.
And so that transparency is important. Look, we'll take a break now, and when we get back, we're going to talk more about the Australian Border Force. One of the areas I want to talk about is one job, multiple careers, and the diversity that's there. And we've touched on a few of the different areas that you can work in, but also like to talk about some of the investigations that the Australian Border Force have done and
Yep.
the results that they've got. But I'm enjoying the chat. I always like catching up with a cop. So
Me too.
yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
All right, we'll be back shortly.